Welcome to this week's workshop. This is the science behind inflammatory foods. And I've got some info in here that I think may be new to you. So, definitely, this is going to be a lot of information about how to eat, what to eat. We're learning about food as medicine, but of course, the flip side of that is food that causes inflammation. So, lots of really good information, specifically with oils and sugars. I am Dr. Heather Bear. I am a licensed nutritionist. I'm a certified nutrition specialist, a mind body medicine practitioner. And ultimately, we are going to talk all about nutrition and maybe a tiny bit of biochemistry, because ultimately, that's what digestion is, right? That's how we process foods. So let's kick things off with a quick question just to get you thinking in the direction that I'm going to be talking. So, which do you think is more inflammatory? The glazed donut, the bowl of pasta, or a plate of fried chicken? And so I'm going to give you a second just to think. And regardless of what you answered, it's actually a trick question. The answer depends on how your body processes these foods. And so if we look at the donut is going to be packed with, yes, processed refined sugar, processed oils, processed flour, which of course is going to spike the blood sugar and trigger inflammation. The whole wheat pasta, or actually not whole wheat, so it's just a bowl of regular white pasta, that could be healthy, but if eaten alone, it can actually still spike the blood sugar and create an inflammatory response. And you'll learn why in just a little bit. The fried chicken, of course, not just the food, but the oil that it was cooked in can make it inflammatory. So when we think about inflammation, there's multiple pathways to an inflammatory response in your body. And so that's what I'm going to be covering today. And that's why it's so important to understand inflammation. It's not just about what's healthy versus what's junk food. These labels can be a little bit deceptive. And so really what's going on, it's all about understanding what's happening in your body. And so let's dive into that. So what are you going to get out of this workshop? Well, really, this is one of the biggest things that we are plagued with. We're going to tackle one of the biggest hidden drivers of inflammation, and that is our food choices. And, we can choose to either fuel chronic inflammation or help lower it. But most of us don't realize how our everyday choices, like the oils that we cook in or the way that we consume sugar, can actually keep us in a cycle of pain, of fatigue, of poor gut health, all of these different things that we've talked about leading up till this workshop. And so this is all about bringing awareness to the foods that can trigger inflammation and empowering you to be able to make simple, actionable strategies to have your health in mind as you decide what to eat. So by the end of this workshop, you're going to be able to understand which foods contribute most to chronic inflammation. These are going to be things like refined sugars, oils, processed fats. You're going to understand the role of omega-3, 6, and 9, those ratios, and how that can affect inflammation in the body. You'll also then learn how to reduce inflammatory foods with cooking methods, reading labels, or just simple ingredient swaps. But my goal is not to overwhelm you. It's to give you this knowledge that's going to allow you to make small but powerful changes that can add up over time. Remember, awareness is power. Inflammation is not just about what you eat, it's about what you know. And the more that you understand what's in your food and how it affects us, the easier it is to make better choices. So let's go into what I'm calling inflammation 101, because, inflammation gets a bad rap. And we've talked a little bit about this before, but the thing is, your body actually needs it. If you twist your ankle or if you cut yourself, like I did yesterday, chopping up onions, inflammation is what's going to help you heal. It's going to stop bleeding. It's going to start the repair process. And that's called acute inflammation, which of course is a good thing. The problem is when our body doesn't shut off, when your body stays inflamed throughout the day. And this can happen because, again, of the food, stress. It can happen from toxins that are just in our environment, our lifestyle habits. And so that's when we start to think about inflammation in terms of chronic inflammation. And this is linked to literally every major health issue, from fatigue to joint pain to bloating, brain fog, poor sleep, even long-term diseases like heart disease, diabetes, dementia, cancer. And so this matters because, you might not even realize how inflammation is showing up in your life. It's one of those things that, a lot of times we just consider our normal. Maybe you wake up feeling stiff or you're exhausted, and no matter how much sleep you get, and, maybe you have gut issues, chronic bloating, or you get migraines every day. Maybe your doctors say, well, it's just stress. But, you know, that could be chronic inflammation. That could be the hidden culprit of whatever it is that you're feeling in your body. And so, one of the biggest drivers that we'll talk about today, just to keep things on topic, is your diet. And so, there's a few really important things to consider here. Number one, the diet is going to be things like processed foods, refined sugars, artificial sweeteners, alcohol. All of these things can be culprits. And we've talked about a lot of these at length. I'm going to break down sugar and fat in just a little bit. But let's not forget that stress and lifestyle is also a big piece of the puzzle. We're not going to get into it in this particular workshop, but I want to make sure that I'm not emphasizing one and then having you kind of reorganize that in your mindset, thinking, oh, it's diet is the most important. No, diet, stress, and lifestyle, of course, sleep. When we're under pressure, when we're sitting all day, your body is going to be in that fight or flight state, which is going to continue to fuel that inflammation. And of course, toxins in our environment, things that are sometimes out of our control, pollution, chemicals in the processed food, even the plastics that we use, all can contribute to inflammation in the body to a lesser extent. But of course, if you're eating the right things, if you're eating plentiful amounts of fruits and veggies and managing your stress, your body has the capability to excrete these toxins and to, keep yourself healthy. But the idea here is that once you understand what's driving your inflammation, you can start to reverse it. And so you don't have to just accept this as your normal. You don't have to accept pain or poor digestion as your quote unquote normal. You can take steps to actually work towards better, a new normal, right? And so we're going to kick things off. Literally, the one thing that I get the most confusion about when I talk about this with my clients is sugar and carbs, right? What's going on? And so there's huge misconceptions with this. And the idea here is that all sugar is a carbohydrate, but not all carbs are going to be processed the same way as sugar. But that depends on what you're pairing them with, not necessarily the carb itself. And so I'll explain this in a minute. You're going to be able to have a better understanding. So just bear with me. So when we talk about inflammation, we tend to separate the two. People think of sugar as bad, but maybe we don't even think twice about having bread or crackers or that bowl of pasta, right? We see them as very different, but the truth is that your body doesn't see much of a difference once it starts to break it down. And so, I have lots of clients, or I have people who chime in on my social media saying, "Oh, I don't eat any sugar. I've completely omitted sugar from my diet. I don't eat any processed sugar. I don't eat any added sugar." And they'll tell me that they're using monk fruit sugar or they're using cane sugar, whatever it is. They're using different types of things that are going to be more holistic. But the reality is, even when you're not eating something sweet, even let's say like a candy bar or something like a piece of fruit, right? You don't have to be eating something sweet. It could be something starchy, like white bread. Your body is going to break it down into glucose. The candy bar, the white bread, the pasta, the crackers, the cake, it all gets broken down into glucose, right? That's what we measure in our blood sugar. And so the only difference between these different types of food is how fast that happens. And so when we look at things like simple sugars, which would be a table sugar, honey, fruit, simple sugars, these are already broken down into smaller molecules. So they hit your bloodstream faster. And you can see this. Looking at the diagram here, you can see maltose, which is in bread, right? This is formed by 2 glucose molecules. That's what maltose is. That's the chemical constituent of the carbohydrate in bread. And so sucrose, comparing maltose to sucrose is formed by linking a glucose to a fructose. This is a disaccharide. It's known as table sugar, right? Very similar. It's still a disaccharide. Lactose, which of course is in milk, this is a galactose to a glucose. And so again, the only difference here is how fast your body's going to process it. All of these are going to be turned into glucose as your body starts to break things down. And so refined carbs, which so many of us are regularly eating, right? It's just part of our diet. White bread, crackers, pasta, white rice. These are just longer chains of glucose. And so the second that your body starts to digest them, you see the chemical constituent, it's glucose, right? They're going to be turned into what we call sugar, right? Almost immediately. And so this is why, eating a bagel your body's going to process. So eating a big white processed bagel, it's very similar to having a can of soda, right, in the morning, as far as your body is concerned. And so this is because if you take a look here at this glycemic index versus glycemic load, this is where we start to understand, right? Not all carbs are going to affect blood sugar the same way. This is why it's so essential to understand the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load. This is where it comes in. So again, looking here, take a look at the soda. We've have a glycemic index, which of course is how fast a food is going to spike your blood sugar. And this is compared to a number 100. So the closer it is to 100, that's pure glucose, the faster it's going to hit the bloodstream. And so a high number is going to be that much more similar, right, to pure glucose. A lower number is going to indicate a slower release. It's a slower burn. Glycemic load is a little different. That's going to measure both how quickly the sugar enters the bloodstream and how much of it is in a standard serving. And so this is why you can have a high GI food, but it may not be a problem in a small amount, like watermelon, for example. And that's here in the chart as well. So take a look here. Soda, we've got a glycemic index of 68, right? The white bread, 2 slices of white bread, glycemic index of 80. So actually the white bread has a higher glycemic index, and yet we are so quick to scrutinize, right, the soda, the things like that, but yet don't think anything of having a couple slices of white bread. Okay. And then, you got your oatmeal, and then you've got your watermelon, which is really high in that glycemic index. But of course, how many of us are eating an entire giant thing of watermelon? Typically, it's got so much water, so much fiber and things like that, that once you take into the consideration of how much you're actually eating per serving, it's much lower. And that's why you're not going to see those blood sugar spikes with things like that. But again, even when you consider the glycemic load for the soda and the white bread, the glycemic load of the soda nominally higher, right? 23 versus 22. Okay. So certainly very, very comparable. And I just want to make that point because it's what confuses so many of us. And so what we start to see here is, this is going to be really important when we talk about inflammation. High glycemic index, high glycemic load foods are going to flood your body with sugar, and that's going to lead to blood sugar spikes. Okay. Insulin is going to then release in your body. Then you have that crash, right, where you start to feel tired. You crave more glucose. So that could be sugar or carbohydrates. And this is that process is going to lead to chronic inflammation, could lead to insulin resistance, right? Because your body has to keep releasing all of that insulin to be able to let the glucose inside of the cells. And of course, excess glucose in the body turns into what? We know this is going to be turned into fat, right? Triglycerides. And so, you've got insulin resistance, weight gain, joint pain, brain fog. Also, not going to get into that, issues with GI because the non-beneficial bacteria are going to be eating up all of those different refined processed carbohydrates. So low GI foods, right? These are going to be things like grains, beans, vegetables. They're going to release the sugar because yes, they still have sugar, but they're paired with fibers. They're paired with different things that are going to be released more slowly, which is going to keep your blood sugar stable. And that reduces inflammation. It gives you steady energy. And so now that we know what sugar and refined carbs can do, we know that they act basically the same way. How do we start making some swaps? How do we figure out what we can eat to not boost inflammation? And so I have this picture here. This is one of the most just easy ways to be able to balance in your body. So again, the solution is fiber. Super simple, super simple. And this is why adding fruits and veggies and grains and legumes and nuts and seeds to your food is so important, because you're literally changing the way that your body processes it. Again, it goes down to biochemistry, and you don't have to understand too much about biochemistry to really make some conscientious decisions, but it makes sense because we eat food, right? It's turned into a fuel source in our body. Our body utilizes that fuel source. And so it's important to understand how, when you pair things together, your body actually reacts to it, right? And so again, fiber being the main solution. Fiber is a game changer when it comes to reducing blood sugar spikes. We've talked about this before in previous weeks. And why is that? Well, fiber slows down sugar absorption. Fiber keeps your blood sugar from spiking. It's going to literally change the glycemic index. And so it not only helps slow down the sugar spike, but it's also going to help feed that beneficial bacteria, which is going to, again, contribute to lowered inflammation. It's going to help keep you fuller longer, which is going to reduce cravings. It's going to reduce energy crashes. And so this is why not all carbs are bad. This is why choosing high fiber foods and whole food carbs is going to be a much better idea than refined ones. And so what I'm proposing here isn't that you never eat processed carbohydrates again. I mean, white bread, white rice, white pasta, that's part of life, right? We don't need to completely omit those. Take a look at this simple swap here. If you see this graph, so this is pizza eaten on its own, right? Just a piece of pizza with the cheese and the sauce. And that's going to have a spike, right? So you can see that the glucose spikes up and then it crashes. But having a salad before your pizza, so having some sort of fibrous food, something very simple, could also be something like a soup, having some sort of fibrous food, whole plant-based food, very simple. Look at how much it changed. You completely avoid the spike. And it's a much milder and not that crash and burn afterwards. And that's still eating the pizza, but pairing something with it so that it doesn't act the same way in your body. You're literally changing the biochemistry of the food that you're eating when you start to combine it with fruits and veggies and nuts and seeds and all of these whole plant-based types of foods. All right, so let's talk about how to break down these smart swaps. Really simple. And of course, a lot of this is intuitive, but so, choosing things like brown rice, quinoa, oats. And one thing with oats, there is some really interesting research that's put out. I think it's Dr. Ludwig, and you'll see Dr. Mark Hyman talking about it a lot. But the idea that oats are going to spike, they did a study where oats spiked the blood sugar versus eggs. And so, of course, they say, oh, it's so much better to have eggs for breakfast than oats. Maybe. I don't believe that. I really think that the oats are still the better way to go. But of course, what are you putting in the oats? Is it just the oats and sweetened with maybe some brown sugar or honey or syrup or something like that? Yeah, that's probably not going to be the best way to make them. The better way to have oats would be with chia seeds, hemp seeds, with some fresh fruits, minimal sweetener, right? Because you want to not have that added sugar. Of course, this is a carbohydrate. It is a starchy carb, but you have the added fiber and it's going to change the way that your body processes it. Same is true for whole wheat, even the pastas and things like that, and the breads, even if it is whole wheat, pairing it is always going to be a better choice. But, avoiding white rice, white flour, processed cereals. And I would say not avoiding the food altogether, but avoiding eating it by itself, right? So I have kids. My daughter has friends who love their white bread with jelly. So they're jelly sandwiches. And it's like, oh my gosh, the peanut butter certainly does change the components of it quite a bit. You've got the protein, you've got the fiber. But, so that would be a really good way to be able to just be mindful. Okay, so if I'm going to have white rice, where am I getting my vegetables? Where am I getting my extra sources of fiber? Same thing, with the white bread or white pasta, cereals, things like that. It's just being more mindful. High fiber carbohydrates, right? These are always great. Adding beans, adding lentils, having a side of vegetables, salads, those types of things. These are going to be really beneficial. It's going to completely change the way that your body processes things. And of course, the processed snacks, so many times we're just reaching for crackers or, anything in the little package things that are going to be mostly refined starchy carbohydrates. Pastries, for example, cookies. I think I've given that trick before, but it doesn't mean no more cake. It doesn't mean no more cookies. Of course, choosing to eat those mindfully, right? And choosing to eat those less frequently than not. But pairing them, making sure that you're not just eating the cookie, you're not just eating the piece of cake, you're pairing that. You're having a handful of nuts and seeds with it, or you're making sure that you've had plenty of vegetables in your meal beforehand. That's it's gonna completely change the way that your body processes things. And of course, the sweeteners. I'm sure that I've touched on this before, but the 0-calorie sugar substitutes. Not great. 0-calorie does not mean healthy. And that's where so many people get fooled, thinking that, 0-calorie sweeteners like monk fruit, stevia, these are going to be the healthy replacements for sugar. But there's a big problem with that. They still, from a perspective of fueling inflammation, they still fuel inflammation. Even though they're not spiking sugar, they still disrupt gut health or gut bacteria, which is directly linked to inflammation. They can confuse your metabolism. There's some research that shows that they still trigger this insulin response, even though they don't spike the blood sugar. And so they don't get you, they don't necessarily spike, but they still cause that blood sugar roller coaster in your body. And that's why your brain is going to still expect sugar. You can start to stay in that cycle. And so the idea here is, instead of swapping all sugar for artificial sweeteners, the better approach is going to be to use smaller amounts of natural sweeteners like honey or dates, and pairing them with fiber, with protein, with your healthy fats to be able to slow down absorption. And so, for example, with coffee, right? Coffee is one of those things people say, oh, do I have, no more sugar in my coffee? Well, just pair it. Try not to have coffee by itself. Use a little bit of honey or agave, or, another natural sweetener that you enjoy. Pair it with your avocado toast and hemp seeds to be able to slow digestion. If you want something sweet, have some yogurt with nuts and seeds instead of a protein bar with these fake sugars that are in it. And of course, with a smoothie, use the whole fruit instead of the sweeteners, the artificial sweeteners that are typically added to it. But the bottom line here is to skip those artificial 0-calorie sweeteners. They are certainly not a better alternative. Choosing whole foods is always going to be the better way to go. Whole foods, whole carbohydrates, whole fats, those types of things. And so now that we've covered carbohydrates and sugar, the other thing that I want to talk about briefly is fats. So some of the basic ways that we understand healthy versus unhealthy fat is saturated and unsaturated, right? And of course, we know that saturated is going to be solid at room temperature. We, consider these unhealthy, but there's a lot of research out there that maybe it isn't. It's so confusing, right? Unsaturated typically is going to be liquid at room temperature, considered quote unquote healthy. The unsaturated fats are the healthy ones. But of course, as I'm sure you're aware, there's so much more to it than that. It's part of why it's so confusing to watch social media or listen to different doctors talk. And so the idea here is, for any of this to be true, we have to be talking about whole fats, not oils. Whole fats are always going to be better than any source of oil. And that's simply because it's less processed. And so, why do we start to call some healthy and unhealthy? Well, again, the type of fats and oils that we consume, they can have a significant impact on our health. Healthy fats, right? Like the fats that are going to be found in avocados, nuts, olives, fish, and to some extent olive oil, they can help lower cholesterol levels, reduce inflammation, support brain function. And of course, unhealthy fats, like many of the vegetable oils, which again are unsaturated, trans fats, and fats like the marbleization in steaks and heavy cheeses and things like that, we know that can lead to increased risks of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and other health problems as well. But why? But how? I've heard so many different things. Like, what am I supposed to believe, right? Because now we've got people talking about beef tallow. Everyone's eating beef tallow in their food and rubbing it on their face, and it's like the most amazing thing. And full fat versus the low fat. And so I'm going to talk through the concept that many of you probably aren't aware of, so that it makes it more clear, so that it's easier to cut through all of the nonsense, all of the noise, and just make an informed decision. And so to do that, we have to talk about omega-3, 6, and 9, and look at what the science actually says. Because it's important. Fat is a really important macro molecule that we need in our bodies. They make up, and right, so in short chain fatty acids, we need those in smaller amounts, but they make up our membranes, they regulate inflammation, they support brain and heart health. And so the key isn't just about which fats you eat, but it's a balance of how you eat them. And so again, when we look at these different types of fats, omega-3, 6, and 9, which I'm sure you've seen just in advertising and omega-3s eating for heart health. Well, omega-3s are essential, which means that our bodies can't make them. So we have to get them from our food. And omega-3 helps reduce inflammation. It helps support brain function. It helps promote heart health. And most people don't get enough omega-3. This is why we have widespread chronic inflammation, the diet-related widespread chronic inflammation, which is going to be a lot of times joint pain, brain fog, those types of things. What you would typically be recommended to take a vitamin supplement for, an omega-3 supplement for, those types of things. Now, omega-6, these are also necessary. We've scrutinized these, right? But these are also an essential fat that we need in our diet, but we need it in a much smaller amount. And these omega-6 fatty acids, they're going to trigger the body's short-term inflammatory response, which again is important. It's for healing. But the issue here is that our modern diet is completely overloaded with omega-6, mostly from processed vegetable oils, fast food, processed foods, all those things that are in the little snack packs. And historically, humans had, an omega-3 to omega-6 ratio of about 1 to 1. But today that was closer to 1 to 15 or even worse. And that's going to keep the body, you have an overwhelming amount of this fatty acid that is literally, its role is to trigger inflammation in the body. And so that's going to keep your body in a chronic state of inflammation. Now, omega-9s, these have long been considered neutral or beneficial. These are the fatty acids that are found in olive oil, in avocado oil, in nuts or nut oils. And they've been associated with improved cholesterol and cardiovascular health. But important to note that there is some research, some long-term studies that look at, health progression over time. And they show that too much omega-9 might not be as harmless as we once thought. So we're going to go into here. So, let's talk about what do we avoid? What do we eat then, right? So we can get right to it. Which fats are best to avoid? Well, oil is commonly used in our diet, right? It's in basically everything. It's in the packaged foods that you eat. It's what we cook with. And it's what we use to make all of our fried foods, which again is so popular in our world today. But most of our prepared foods are made with heavily processed, refined oils that aren't necessarily great for our health. And why is that? Why do we choose to use these? Well, they undergo a process that involves bleaching and deodorizing, which can result in the formation of these harmful compounds, which are basically oxidation byproducts. And so oils that are extracted naturally through processes like crushing or pressing, like whole plants, or the seeds, they have less of the byproducts in them. And so they're going to be a healthier alternative. And again, these naturally extracted oils, they're going to be able to retain more of the nutrients, the antioxidants that are found in plants, which, makes them a healthier choice. And so how do we pick? Well, for your oils that you use at home, you can opt for cold pressed extra virgin olive oil. Now, all extra virgin olive oil is supposed to be cold pressed, but again, marketing loves to use all kinds of like deceptive things. So you can, just look for the bottle, as you can see here, the circle. You can find, it says first cold pressed. It's a little bit more expensive. It's better to buy it not in a huge thing because they do go rancid if saved for a long period of time. So you want to be able to use your olive oil typically, within 30 days. But other oils are extracted again using chemical solvents, oil mills, and they contain trace amounts of the chemicals that actually were used in these are things like soybean oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, corn oil. All of these oils are often labeled as like vegetable oil. And so the idea here is that if you can choose natural, that's always going to be your better bet over the refined oils. And remember, whole fats, eating the whole fat is always a better option than the oil. I want to make it clear that oil is not a health food. There's a lot of people who try to claim that oil is a health food. It is not a health food. It is something that we can eat and we can get some benefits from. I mean, think of like red wine, right? Red wine or some of the different things that come from alcohol. It may have some of the beneficial, properties of the plant still intact, but ultimately there's a trade-off. And so the reason here that I say that is because oil can quickly skew the omega-3 to 6 ratio. And of course, that ratio is really important. Omega-3s are the ones that are going to be supporting, the inflammation. Omega-6 are going to be supporting their pro-inflammation. And we need both of them, but we don't want more of the inflammatory omega-6 than we have of the omega-3. It needs to be balanced. Both are essential. It's the ratio that matters. And so when we eat a lot of oil, it's really easy to skew that. And I'm going to show you this with a chart in just a second. But again, taking a look here, omega-6, the ideal ratio really is 1 to 1. And when we start to look at this, here we go. This is something that I wanted to show. I think it's really important to be able to see. So notice here, so on the bottom we have, the red is the saturated fat. The yellow is your omega-9, oleic acid. The orange is your ALA or your omega-3, and your blue is the omega-6. And so just take a look here and see. So if we're looking at the omega, so the omega-9, a lot of these are really, really high omega-9, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but could potentially be not so beneficial for our health. But again, just looking at the omega-3 to 6 ratio, so you're looking at the orange to blue, okay? Orange being the quote unquote anti-inflammatory, the good, if for simplicity, let's say the orange is the good, the blue is the bad, right? Unless only if it's overskewed. And so all of these, canola oil, sunflower oil, flaxseed oil is the only one. And let me tell you, flaxseed oil, it tastes very fishy, certainly, and you can't cook it with it. It doesn't stable when you heat it up. This would be something that if you enjoy the taste of like fishy flavor, you could put it on your salads or something like that. I take it as a supplement, and that is about the extent of it. But you know, your sunflower oil as well. I mean, look at just overwhelmingly how much more omega-6 is in here. Even the olive oil, if we take a look at olive oil, and that is going to be where is it? I know it's here. Coconut oil, palm, lard, olive oil, kind of right in the middle. All right, so if you take a look at olive oil, we have, again, 9-to-1. Okay, so if you're eating a lot of olive oil, yes, it has a lot of omega-9, and that's why it's technically considered heart healthy, but it's still, the ratio is 9-to-1. Right? So if you're eating a lot of olive oil, if you're going out of your way to eat olive oil thinking that it's healthy, it could be very easy to skew that ratio into the inflammatory response just by eating olive oil. And so that's why it's very important to be mindful of how much oil you're eating. And that's why I say that oils are not health foods, because it's very, very to overdo it with the omega-6, unless you're eating flax oil, which is very, very palatable. All right, so let's really quickly touch on the omega-9s. I into this, but again, taking a look at here. So the other thing too, look at how much omega-9, right, is in all of these oils as well. Well, I found a study that I wanted to share. There was and of course, omega-9s, whole fat omega-9s, olive oils, avocados, olives, nuts, right? So there's a lot of really great beneficial whole foods. It's really hard to eat too much whole foods. But in studies, I found a study that followed people for 10 plus years, and they found that both too little and too much omega-9 can be problematic. And so essentially, there was this huge risk curve. Too little was harmful because, of course, it plays an essential role in cholesterol balance. But too much, what they mentioned specifically was from excessive oil consumption, can also increase inflammation, heart failure, and those heart failure. And so how do we start to get too much omega-9? Well, it's literally overusing oils, pouring olive oil on everything and assuming that it's beneficial. Eating too many nuts and seeds to an extent. There are some people that go overboard. Some of the nuts, and some of the people who make these nuts, right, and these nut sauces could start to get, a little bit overboard. And consuming these heart healthy processed snacks that are intentionally loaded with omega-9s or omega-9 oils, but then lack the fiber and the other nutrients to help balance them out, all of these can be problems. And so the idea here is the solution here to focus on whole foods and balance, right? I'm not saying don't use oil. I'm saying use it mindfully. You don't want to rely on any single fat source. Instead of, drenching everything in olive oil, you want to get varieties from whole fat sources, avocados, nuts, seeds, fatty fish. Prioritizing omega-3s, which again, most people are lacking, or excessively using the omega-9s. And of course, use oils sparingly. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But real quick, again, what happens when we have too much omega-6? And again, the omega-9 and the omega-6 in the oils. We're getting these from oil. Again, linked to so many different things. And I'm not going to cover this again because we've talked about it, but literally, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and more. And all of those are just triggered by chronic inflammation. And so how do we start to find the sustainable balance? Well, again, the first step is just bringing awareness to your food choices. What are you eating? How much oil is in it? What kind of oil is it? And, if we could do the best with what we can control, with foods that we prepare, for example, at home, we can worry a little bit less about when we're out. The idea really is to bring balance, not to be, completely worried about everything that we're eating, just have a really good understanding of how to bring balance into your day to day. Going out to eat, it's a social experience. It shouldn't be something that we want to avoid. It shouldn't be something that we have to be worried about or preoccupied about. You know, when we don't have control over situations or how the food is prepared, that's okay because our body can ultimately handle it from time to time. And so making the best with what you have in that moment is always going to be a really good way to work towards balance, right? So you can have the healthiest choices that are available to you in that moment. It's super simple. You look for healthy plant-based foods, veggies, fruits, whole grains, a piece of fish, right? This is all going to help balance that ratio. And of course, moderation, this is all going to be really, really important too. Moderation is something that, we don't have once or, when I talk about moderation and they say, oh, I only have something sweet once a day, or I only have, ice cream 5 times a week, or I only have, I would say work towards moderation being something that's, going to be once a week, once a month, those types of things where it becomes something that you actually enjoy. It's not something you do habitually. This is something that you're enjoying. This is a special occasion, right? This is something you're enjoying with family and friends, and it's, a celebrated event. So let's quickly talk through some strategies to cook with less oil. When we're preparing foods at home, this is really, really interesting. And so many people don't realize that you actually can cook most of your foods. So you can saute without any oil. You can use water, you can use stock, you can use bone broth. But depending on what you're using, it's so simple. And you really don't taste the difference. It's not like we need the oil to make it more palatable. But let's see, there's also oil sprays. Of course, look at the back of the bottle because some of the oil sprays are loaded with different types of chemicals to make it more pliable. But oil spray that you look and it says, just olive oil or just avocado oil, those are going to be great because you can just kind of dust it with the oil and not have to overuse it. And of course, air fryers are amazing. If you haven't bought or invested in an air fryer, this is something that actually took a while for me. I heard so many people using it and there were so many recipes I wanted to try. And then once I got one, I don't stop using it. It's amazing. And trick, of course, get the little parchment paper trays so that cleanup is extra easy. All right, so these are some of the ideas here. I love, the chicken bone broths, the chicken broths, or the veggie broth, the spray things that you can get. These are all really simple ways to be able to just cook with less. Really, you should be focusing on the herbs, the spices, turmerics and ginger and garlic. Those are all going to be powerful anti-inflammatory foods that you can add to it, and it's going to make your food taste amazing with any oil. All right. And so when you're out at dinner at restaurants or, even for lunch and things like that, really easy to just ask how the food is prepared, just communicate with the people who are making your food. Most of the time, they're very, very happy to accommodate a no order, please. I've asked for it many times at many of the different Asian types of Thai or noodle places, sushi restaurants, Chinese food places. All of them are very, very willing to cook oil. You can also, of course, opt for grilled or blackened or seared, steamed, great ways to be able to do it, especially if you've got a lot of really great seasoning. And you can do this by planning ahead. So if you're going to go out to eat somewhere, if you know that, you go out to eat every day for lunch, taking some time to plan, maybe calling a couple restaurants or seeing which ones are going to be willing to accommodate your requests or which have great go-to options that aren't going to be, loaded with oil and things like that and have a lot of whole foods. These then you have in your back pocket and you just, you know where to go, you get hungry and you go. All right. So let's go through some of the quick tips to get started. I know that was a lot and certainly we can talk more on this, but these are some important to understand. The first here is chronic inflammation. It's linked to fatigue, pain, poor digestion, long-term disease, all of the things that we are plagued with. And so really getting into this mindset that you can either fuel or fight inflammation by just bringing balance and awareness to the foods that you're eating, right? Cutting through all of the nonsense out there because there is so much nonsense and just using awareness, education to be able to make better decisions. Of course, the role of sugar and processed carbohydrates and fats, which we'll talk about in a minute, but refined sugar and high glycemic carbs, they spike your blood sugar. They increase cravings, they drive inflammation. And so, cutting out sugar, but not, but but not starchy carbs. They're the same thing. Your body doesn't know the difference. So you really want to make some smart swaps. You really want to make sure that you're including whole plant-based foods with these types of foods, whole grains, fiber-rich things, all of these things are going to help change the way that your body processes it. And of course, fats, remember you've got omega-3s, 6s, 9s. The standard American diet overloads the omega-6s, and it's going to keep the body in a chronic state of inflammation. We use oil way too excessively. Some people actually believe and will say it makes me crazy online to see people saying, oh, oil is a health food. No, it's not. You want to prioritize omega-3s. So that's going to come from whole foods, unless you're drinking flax oil, which tastes gross. But wild fish, flax, chia, hemp seeds, all of these things are going to be able to help you restore that balance. Cooking oils are a huge source of inflammation. We use so much oil. Yet again, we use so much oil, and not all oils are created equal. Remember, seed oils, they're going to be heavily processed. They're going to be a little bit more inflammatory. You saw the different ratios, right? The better choices are going to be to use minimally processed oils, whole food fats, and then opt for the healthier cooking methods. Just a little bit goes a long way. And so the simple steps to reduce inflammation, again, read the labels, be mindful of hidden ingredients, especially with sugars and oils. Experiment with some new cooking methods to be able to reduce your oil, like roasting, steaming, using broths in your saute pan. These swaps plus your awareness is going to really add up and make some big changes. So if you do have questions, feel free to reach out. You know exactly how to contact me. You can set up a one-on-one. You still have available time to do that, and we can go through any of your questions individually. So I hope you found that helpful. I hope you don't feel overwhelmed, but more empowered to make some amazing choices and to reduce inflammation in your body. Thank you so much.